Welcome to our discussion, Walking the Talk. We're going to be talking about investing in the future of Black entrepreneurs and opportunities and investing in Black banks, part of the Milken Institute's virtual forum. But before we get started, I want to remind everyone that this live stream session is being recorded and will be made available at the Milken Institute website following this event. We encourage you to share this with your network and to continue this important conversation over social media. This session is a part of the ongoing virtual series of programming hosted by the Institute that has covered timely topics over the past year, from vaccine development to strategic philanthropy to market implications regarding the coronavirus. Today, however, we're going to focus on the problems facing Black entrepreneurs. Here's a couple of facts before I introduce our distinguished panel. Black entrepreneurs face greater challenges in the short term and in the long term. The number of active business owners fell by 20% from February to April in 2020. That's the largest drop ever recorded. However, the rate of failure was twice that as high for Black businesses, ranging at 41%. And the federal government's Paycheck Protection Program, PPP, for small businesses only reached 20% of eligible recipients in the area of high-density Black-owned businesses. In 2017, there was $84 billion in VC deals made. The majority of them were done by 135 funds, and supported over 4,750 companies. But according to surveys of these companies, just 1% had Black founders or co-founders. And we know that Black entrepreneurs tend to start their business with a third less capital than white-owned businesses. And this disparity in capital tends to average more than 7 years after the startup. With today's discussion, we'll be seeking to answer the following questions. What type of investments and infrastructure are required to reverse these trends? What are the challenges to expanding financial inclusion in different communities across the country? And are there specific innovations or actors poised to improve economic opportunity in Black entrepreneurs? We're going to ask our guests to give an opening statement addressing one or two of these questions. But let me introduce our distinguished guests to the panel. Our first guest is Emanuel Friedman. We call him Manny. He is the CEO, the co-CEO, and co-chief investment officer of EJF Capital, LLC. Next is Joe Haskins, Jr., co-founder and chairman and CEO of Harbor Bank of Maryland. Tracy Gray, founder and managing partner, the 22 Fund. And Henry Charles, CEO of Minority Wealth Commission and chairman and president of BCF Capital. At this point, I would like to start with Manny, having them introduce themselves, their entity, and address one of the questions.
Sure, thank you very much. So we're a fund based in Washington, D.C. with offices in London, and we run approximately $11 billion. Much of it is in the financial area, and it's throughout the debt stack and the equity stack, and also private investments. We're especially excited this year because we saw in the stimulus bill, at least for me, it was the biggest change in my lifetime that I've seen, where the government actually made a real effort to try to jumpstart the minority banks and all the CDFI, which are the community development banks in the United States, which there are over 500 of them. And they provided allocated $9 billion as preferred stock, which Treasury would buy direct from these institutions between 0.5% and 2%, which is very, very attractive financing. Assume they make loans to the community that where they're located. So that to me is really a watershed moment for the U.S. government, where they actually have taken a direct action to recognize the importance that minority banks and community development banks play in terms of holding the fabric of the country together, and the fact that there's a massive multiplier impact. 9 billion becomes 90 billion because every bank can leverage this money 10 to 1, and really takes them to a new level, because in our system, strength begets strength and weakness begets weakness. And so if we make these banks superstars, super companies that can grow and can make large amounts of loan and have protected capital, and it's a game changer. So for me, and for many people who are involved in this, including the Milken Institute, this is really the biggest thing in my lifetime. And we're really waiting for the final rules, or the rules, so that just to make sure that this is really done without any strings attached, which would then, if they do put strings, it'll cripple the program.
Okay, thank you, Manny. Let's go to Joe Haskins.
Thanks. It's good to be with you all. I'm honored to be a part of such a distinguished panel. And I'd like to say, Gene, for me, this is a great opportunity. But first, let me mention Harbor Bank. Harbor Bank was founded, we're 39 years old. And by mentioning that, I exposed my age. But early on, I saw that there was a need for access to banking services, specifically in the African-American space. And our founding in Baltimore was to address many of those needs. And so I have been committed to this access to capital over that past 40 years, in fact, even before the formation of the bank. What we have evolved here at Harbor is a holding company that not only has the bank as its primary subsidiary, but also a private equity unit, so that we can bring equity dollars to the table. And I'll come back to speak about the importance of equity later. But we also created a subsidiary that allowed us to specialize in utilizing tax credits under the CDFI program, because it aided us in incenting development in underserved areas. And we're proud to say that Harbor Bank has been one of the largest recipients of these tax credits since its inception, and has been catalytic in having developed more than $2.5 billion worth of development in the Baltimore City area. Now, to the comments made by my colleague, I can tell you, having started in banking in the 70s and at what is now the JP Morgan Chase, which we'll mention a little bit later, it was then the Chemical Bank. I can tell you that financial resources are vital for any organization to have any meaningful growth, as long as there's comparable knowledge for understanding how to utilize it. I can tell you, over my 40-odd years of operations, there has never been a moment where there has been this kind of capital available in the minority space. We're talking about, as already Manny, and if Manny doesn't mind me referring to him as you do, has already mentioned that there's $9 billion, and this is out of the government side of the house. But at the same time, we're also seeing this come out of the private sector and with many other banks. In fact, we are in final negotiations with JP Morgan Chase for a capital infusion as we speak. So we have a very unique moment here that will allow us to access capital that has not been readily available in the minority banking space at this level at any point in the history of this country. And I think it is a seminal moment. And given the fact that we can access this capital, we can move more resources into those communities of need.
Oh, great. Okay, thank you. So Tracy, how are you?
Hi, Jean. Thank you for having me, and thank you for the Milken Institute for inviting me to speak today. And thank you, panelists, for allowing me to join you. I'm the managing partner and founder of the 22 Fund. The 22 Fund is an early growth equity fund. We invest in manufacturing companies to increase their export capacity. Our mission is increasing generational wealth for Brown and Black people and women, and also creating what we call the clean quality jobs of the future for underserved and LMI communities. We call ourselves holistic investors, not impact investors, because we're looking at multiple issues that we can impact just through our investment strategy. As many of you might know on the phone, that manufacturing is the foundation of our economy. And we saw during the pandemic how, unfortunately, manufacturing did not have access to capital and weren't able to pivot in the way they needed to create the PPE. So, and also exports. With exports, our country does not export. We have maybe 1% to 3% of our companies export, but exports create jobs faster than any other economic development tool. And coupled with manufacturing, the jobs are high paying, 94,000 on average, and they're more likely to have healthcare. And because manufacturing is moving toward industry 4.0, meaning that manufacturing is tech enabled and tech based, it would bring a different demographic into the tech sector that frankly is not happening in traditional venture capital and startups. Now, I do believe that moving capital to fund managers of color is really how we see the, for lack of a better word, trickle down economics. You invest in fund managers of color, they invest in entrepreneurs of color, and then we hire Brown and Black employees. But I think we're going to need, there's a lot of capital out there, but 98.7% of all asset managers are white men. We're a little overexposed there with the white men. And if that capital was leveraged and aggregated from organizations like the CRA, which I know we may talk about later, the SBIC, and pension funds, and brought into, aggregated to be invested in women and people of color, we're going to innovate and have different strategies than you see the standard venture capital strategy. I stopped using the term inclusion when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, because it sounds like we have to be invited to certain tables instead of us creating the new models. And so innovation is where we've had to, as Black and Brown people and women, we've had to innovate because of the lack of capital. So I think if we can leverage the capital from government and private sector and the pension funds and bring this toward women and people of color, especially Black people, we'll see innovative ways to access capital, including debt, equity, and revenue share. So that's what I'm looking at. I'm looking both at what I can do at a firm level and how we can work together for systems change and unlock a lot of this capital that's there. There is enough. We just have to move it toward the right place.
Well, you brought up something very interesting I'm going to ask you later, because we know that since 2009 recession recovery, 40% of the jobs created, 2/3 of the jobs were created by small businesses. 40% of those were women. And of those 40%, 70% was women of color. So job creation is very important, and access to capital is very important in that job creation. So thank you. I will come back to you on that after. But let's go to our next guest, Henry. If you can introduce yourself.
Thank you, Eugene. Thank Milken. I want to start with BCF Capital. We made our first loan in 1987. Over our existence, we financed over 942 certified minority businesses. We're certified CDFI, and we also have an SBA SSBIC as a subsidiary. But I just, you know me, I'm a bit of a contrarian. I want to touch on some things I've heard today because I really want to frame this discussion properly. When we talk about $9 billion, like the government kicked out $2 trillion in the CARES Act. So $9 billion is a small sliver. And we realized that the reason you cited earlier, Black businesses closed from February to April at 40% rate, we don't ask the follow-up question, which is why. And what we're witnessing in this fourth industrial revolution is just all small businesses are struggling right now. If you're not a digital business, you're going to have trouble meeting the needs of customers. So what we really focus on is innovation. I can tell you, go through my litany of experience, but the truth is, if you are not experienced at this time and age in artificial intelligence and machine learning and big data, I don't care if you're Black, Hispanic, Asian or white, you will have trouble in this new economy. So what we had to do is we had to change our model from traditional, senior secured and some sub to really talking about how do we fund the minority economy ourselves. And that's what we're doing at the Minority Wealth Commission. We are building a self-sustaining minority economy where we take the best in data, we take the best in financing, we take the best in innovation, because we've been beating on doors since the 60s trying to get people to fund us. And the truth is we have to fund ourselves, and we've had tremendous success doing that in the market. So to answer your question, what is the new model? The new model is we get a big fund and we make sure that we have the right backbone in data and artificial intelligence, and we start taking care of this market.
Very well said. Thank you, Henry. So I want to go back to Joe. Based on what you just heard from Henry, which I think is very key to focus and dialogue on this a little further. You mentioned that not only bank debt loans, but equity. How does this play in what we just heard from Henry about growth and wealth in the Black community? Because we know that, typical banking underwriting has startled some of this growth.
Well, Jane, thanks for coming back to me. I will say that I basically am in agreement with Henry, and I would only have one slight variation to say that while I agree with the trillion number, but when no billions have been available, then those billions come across as significant, especially in our space. Now, but going back to the innovative side of it, the reason I mentioned to you about Harbor, at one point, Harbor was a high-performing bank up to about 2000, but with technology and with the digital world kicking in, and also with a changing environment in banking. If you go back to banking, when I started in banking institutions made 75, 80% of their money out of spread. So they got you to deposit, we loaned it out, and that was where we made our money. Today, given banks, if you look at that whole paradigm has shifted. So 75 to 80% is coming out of fees.
Mhm.
Well, because of the narrowing margins, I recognized in 2000 that we needed to do something else, which is why I set up these other subsidiaries. Like my subsidiary with the new market tax credit, I've brought in major private sector investors. In fact, JP Morgan just reported in one of the announcements that they made in the partnership with me, one of the projects we did in Washington, D.C. Well, by us doing that, that entity, which is run by 4 people, made more money in 14 years than the bank made in 39 years.
Mhm.
So recognizing that you had to be innovative. If I go to my private equity side, we did 3 deals in December that totaled 90 million, involving 3 people on the private equity side, which produced uh, more than the bank made. So I would agree that you've got to change the paradigm, and traditional banking, traditional community banking cannot survive unless it is more dynamic and more innovative. And the other part of where you got to be careful is you can't be all things to all people. You've got to be very segmented and recognize where you can bring value added to the table. The quality of your underwriting will determine what happens. My last point that I'll make, and I made this before, the benefit that we bring to the table is, and you are from Baltimore, you know this, there's very little that happens in Baltimore that I don't know about or I don't hear about. And so I can get those who need to get permitting done, which allows them to engage in a business or development that they could not get involved in. And because of my relationship with the city council, I can have things move through city council faster, which gives a community banker an edge over a larger player or a player who's coming from the outside. So the role of the community bank is necessary, but I would agree with Henry that it's got to be innovative and it's got to educate those who are not in the digital world to be able to transition into that space, because that's what's going to lead to an overall long-term success.
Thank you, thank you. So Manny, I want to talk about this $9 billion and the fact that we don't have the rules and the regulations out from Treasury. How do you see this tenfold going into the underserved communities? And what do you think is going to be a hiccup or in the implementation of this? And how do we know it's going to be targeted correctly?
So the $9 billion, again, we don't, as you said, we don't have the rules. It's going to be targeted correctly. To get the $9 billion, you would have to make, at least $9 billion of loans into the community, because it specifically designs, lists the medium income of the community. So it's exactly targeted really for rural communities and for urban communities that are below the median average. So the targeting is there in the rule. The fear is that, people will not view it as, look, we're going to put the money in the banks and we're going to let them go, because they're not asking for the money. We're just trying to jumpstart, the effort by these banks. And again, they have, originally they talked about putting lots of restrictions, dividends, compensation. Well, as you go on and on down that path, you end up with bank after bank saying, look, it's not worth it. I don't want the government in my back pocket. And the money never goes out except to very, very few people. As Henry said, 9 billion is very little, though it is a lot for these banks, as it does count as equity. And that's a massive difference, even though it's preferred stock. And so, and it's a very, very low coupon, 0.5% to 2%. depending on the amount of loans you make. So it is big, but it's, as Henry pointed out, it's only big relative to the fact that, and Joseph pointed out, it's only big relative to the fact they've never done anything, period. You know, they've never been willing to put money directly in the banks, or depository institutions. I don't know what the rules are going to be, but I hope they'll take a bigger approach and, you know, really create wealth in this total situation. You know, and obviously we'll know when we know, but we actually started with 20, 30 billion, but it came down as everyone takes their cut at it. But in the new bill, it's out there. It's a $1.7 trillion, $1.9 trillion. There's really nothing in it for minority or CDFI institutions. But, you know, what has been done by the government and really been done by the big banks, at least just starting finally, where they're actually putting direct equity into. The real problem is, you know, the dominant piece in the United States and the world really is not the banks. It's Apple, it's Amazon, it's Netflix, it's Microsoft, it's Google, it's Facebook. Look at their market cap. They completely dominate the country, and you're talking about 5, 6, 7 company monopoly that has 10, 20% of the entire economy, have strangleholds on their own piece. And, you know, once in a while they say, well, we're going to put a deposit in a bank, in a minority bank. Well, those people, that those institutions should understand their obligation to society and say, look, we're going to put $1 billion, we're going to put 10 billion, we're going to put 30 billion, 50 billion. I mean, these are companies that are earning tens of billions a quarter. And I don't understand why, you know, the dominant factors in the economy don't view themselves as, you know, part of the entire community.
Well, I think that's a totally different topic and conversation, and we can have a webinar on that on its own. But hopefully they'll take their
banks and the pressure put in, and they finally have gotten the big banks to think a little bit bigger by saying, look, why don't you put direct equity in the banks? Why don't you, you know, take them to the next level, even though they might be competitors with you? And I think the big banks have made so much money. They got completely protected in March. They got a monopoly. Their profits went through the roof because of trading and everything that happened. So, you know, we finally have them, you know, actually for the first time putting, you know, very small amounts of equity rather than you know, making, you know, joint loans or whatever. But you know, that part's exciting.
Well, you're absolutely right. But let's talk about something other than the bank. Let's talk about this equity, and let's talk about equity infusion. And we mentioned earlier, Tracy, that only 1% of VC funds go into Black-owned companies and whatnot. And we know the players, and, as you pointed out so well. So what do we need to do to get more equity infusion and equity capital into small minority businesses? And what is the advantage of equity over debt?
Well, first of all, I keep wanting to say amen each time these guys speak. You know, I feel like I'm in church and I want to like jump up and down. So first, the importance of equity for companies. Equity allows you to beat your competitors to market and scale fast, right? You can't, it's difficult to scale quickly when you have to service debt. Not only just the, you know, the amount of money you have to service, but psychologically knowing you have to service that debt makes you take less risk, and which means less innovation. So equity is very important to scaling. That's how you get all these startups being these billion-dollar companies and these unicorns, because they had that equity capital really early, or at every stage, actually, not just early, but every stage. And, you know, what we forget is, a friend of mine says, finance is not about money. It's about power. And we, as women and people of color, especially Black people, do not have power over capital. We're constantly looking for handouts. But we need to get capital into these funds of funds who will go into fund managers, who will go into entrepreneurs, who will hire people of color. And there's, examples of programs that were supposed to help this. If you think about the emerging manager programs at any pension funds, if you look to who's getting the most of the fees, like at I think it's CalPERS, 98% of the fees for the emerging manager funds are going to white male managers. And if you look at any of the big conferences, there'll be 1,000 people there for the emerging manager conference, and it's mainly white men. So, and if you'll see the consultants that who manage the emerging manager program funds, one of the largest, they've made 700 investments into emerging managers, and only 100 were people of color, all people of color. So there's this broken in the system, and I want to go back to what Henry said. We have to create a different ecosystem for people of color because we are not allowed in the existing system. And ways we can do that is, I've said to you before, CRA capital, we need to unlock that where it's not just going to the same players of affordable housing, CDFIs and SBICs. They need the capital too, but it can go into anyone who is creating jobs. My fund, our mission is creating jobs, but as an example, it's hard for me to get to CRA capital because the banks do not want to go through the process of going to the regulator. And they say it's a lot of work. I say it's laziness, tomato, but something's got to change. So there's capital out there like CRA capital that can be unleashed. There's capital like discretionary funds for pension funds where they don't have to go to their board or their investment committee, and 20 million, 100 million, depending on the size of the fund, could be aggregated throughout with all the pension funds, giving to a fund of funds and have them manage it where it just goes to brown and black or underrepresented people of color. There's plenty of capital out there to have change. It's either there's just no incentive for this change because the people who created the system are winning hand over foot, right? They're making money hand over foot. Why would they change? But all the research shows that when you invest in first-time funds and diverse funds, you see higher returns. And even with my fund, investing in manufacturing and exports, it's a recession-proof strategy. We know what happened to companies that exported in the last recession. They had higher revenues, 37%. They made it through the recession better. So I bring this up because there's strategies that brown and black people are thinking of that are innovative and different, but the capital isn't allowing us to do these strategies that we know help our communities. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. But it also takes me back to Henry, because Henry, I want to piggyback on what you just heard from Tracy. You mentioned that we need to create a new ecosystem, a new economy. How would we go about doing that? What is the short-term goal of the Minority Wealth Commission and long-term goal? How do you do that environment ecosystem that you're suggesting?
Yeah, I think that the spine of it is economic development done the right way. I was in the government, I was running MBDA when the shutdown occurred. And the rollout just of the government programs, the PPP, and some of the other ones, you just know immediately it's not going to have the effect that it's intended to have if you have just a basic knowledge of minority communities. So what you have to have is you have to have really three principles. You have to have collaboration, right? The power of networks. One thing that I've done is I've, made sure that we've had our economic development groups, our ethnic chambers, our Fortune 500 companies, and our economists working together on the top plans, which is eradicating the racial wealth gap. So that's number one. Number two, you have to have investment. I don't want to go into what the other panelists have talked about, But I mean, we see the power. We know how to make money in America, right? 2/3 of the people in the top 1% own their own business. Capitalism is about ownership. So we can keep talking about job creation, but we need to start talking about ownership. And the way that you really get to be rich is you start your company, you get people invested in it, and that's debt and equity. And then you grow. We have 0 Black businesses in the Fortune 500. We have the formula to do that, but it has to be a combination of debt and equity. And the third thing is innovation, and I cannot touch this enough. The fourth industrial revolution has disrupted every type of business. You have got to always be in constant state of building new concepts and building new capabilities because things are changing. You know, the old model of a 5-year business plan, that's what we teach people, our MBA students. You need a 5-year business plan. Your 5-year business plan is obsolete because we have a new technology that's disrupting everybody every 6 months. And these waves of technology just keep coming and coming. So if your company cannot continuously change, you're going to die. And that's why Amazon was able to report $100 billion quarter, because they were prepared for the future of work 6 years ago. So we have to, if we really want to be serious about this, it's banking important, yes, but we really have to talk about the way to grow these businesses, and it's through innovation.
Well, thank you. I want you to know that here at the Milken Institute, under the Center of Regional Economics, we are focused on the future of work for that very reason. And so our colleague here, Matt Horton, you want to talk to him about that. You guys will really connect well. I want to go back to Joe. Joe, based on what we just heard on building wealth and building this new economic system and everything, would you adding alternate products and services such as equity into your mix of capital, how is traditional underwriting requirements holding us back from distributing this money? Where do we make that change? Where do we go from the redlining, the underwriting, all the things that are holding back the distribution of money to the ground?
Let me try to come at this sort of in a dissecting way. I've worked through so many different innovations that I have to say this. One, education, I think, is vital because someone can have the idea of making the best widget and with the best ideas, but if they don't know how to access money and properly capital stack, they're going to fail. And I have more experiences with that than I can count. The other part that I'll tell you, and I'll expand on this, is we have to help people see when a direction is changing. So for example, in Baltimore, we could see that there was a shift in where business development was going to take place around the water. Well, if you are a minority developer, you shouldn't be building your project if you're trying to scale in a community that's so low income that the affordability won't allow for there to be activity sufficient for you to be profitable. So you have to have people understand the geographics and the locations, because once you've been able to earn enough money and get enough in play, you can then look to be more philanthropic and do more helpful things. The other piece that I want to bring out is, and having seen and witnessed this over the days, and this also drifts over to the private equity side. And on the debt side of the house, if you're buying a house and your house, you're getting a mortgage rate at 3%, and somebody else is getting a mortgage rate of 7%, that person, every time they make a paycheck or a payday, is losing wealth. We know that real estate, especially home ownership, has been a major contributor to wealth building in this country. If we go back and if you look at yesterday's Wall Street Journal, you'll see the lower rate of African Americans participating in home ownership versus that of whites. And the sad part about it is that many of those who are purchasing in communities where they get no appreciation. So wealth creation is being deprived, denied in that perspective. The other part of it is, I can tell you that there's so many businesses not understanding that you don't go to a loan shark or these private lenders and pay 14 or 15% for money when it's an option to get it at 5 or 6%. That's on the debt side, because your margin of profit in that business may only be 5 to 10%, and you may be giving that away. If you can't help that person understand that, then that person is doomed to a failure. On the equity side, you can give away too much of your ownership before you've been able to realize a certain amount of growth and profitability. So I'm big on innovation, but I'm big on education and helping to direct someone in a path that puts them in a position to max out on the resources that they're out there. Because I would grant you that there are resources out there, but I will also quickly tell you that the resources are not as available in the African American space as they are in the majority community.
Well, you know, it's interesting you said that, and I love the idea of the education. One of the things we're doing here at the Milken Institute is looking into technical assistance and how we can use behavioral science to nudge people to be educated in that very area, particularly when it comes to debt equity ownership ratio. So I'm glad you brought that up. That's a very key point. I want to go now to Manny. Manny, based on what you just heard, I want to really go back to Henry's statement and Joe's statement. What are the specific innovations or actors that are posed to improve the economic opportunity for Black entrepreneurs? Where are we today, and where should we be?
Well, the real issue is the only real institutional support actually comes from the banks. And that is because, as Tracy mentioned, the specific CRA rules and because the Federal Reserve Board, FDIC, has some input, they're able to force or have some money, put into the lower median income areas, whether they be rural or urban. And the real problem is, okay, banks are a tiny sliver of the country. And the same way Tracy and Henry said, okay, how do we really create wealth? Well, there's plenty of, you just have to broaden it massively, where you force not $9 billion or 90 billion into the communities where it's really needed. You force or incentivize for 100 billion, for $1 trillion. $1 trillion is nothing, as Henry said. It's literally nothing. We've seen now from the stimulus bills, $1 trillion used to be, like the end of the world. Now it's, one flick of a pen. But you have trillions of dollars sitting in every pension fund, every endowment fund in the United States. And if they just made some effort to push it in a certain direction, which they're doing a little bit on ESG when it comes to climate change, a tiny bit, but fine, climate change is no more important than the health of our society. If we don't have a healthy society, who cares about climate change? So you can force billions and trillions into these areas, fine. If Tracy wouldn't be here right now, if she had a fund of $10 billion, she'd be working at it day and night. And so that's what you really have to do. And we see that in the ESG area a little bit. So there is a mechanism to get there. And I think the mistake is not thinking much bigger. And that is, okay, how do we get, pension funds as a group or institutional money as a group to say, fine, you're committing yes, you will commit 1%, which is nothing, but that still would be hundreds of billions of dollars. And the same thing with the larger non-bank corporations in the United States. They have a disguised monopoly. They got that monopoly one way or another from the government's regulations. Okay, so now you coax them into what their obligations are, period. Otherwise, we're not going to solve anything if we try to do it step by step. We must do it by taking really big, bold steps. When we have to think, is really Henry and Tracy said, we have to think in terms of tens of billions, of trillions, and that is what will create its own momentum. And that's what really has to happen. In the same way, I just look every single day, there are companies being capitalized at 10 billion, 20 billion, 30 billion. And there are new space companies, new LiDAR companies for measuring distance, new, semiconductor companies, battery technology. They won't even be available for 24, 12. They're capitalizing them at $30 billion. They don't even have $1 of revenue. So the money is out there, and we just have to, move it a little bit in other directions because it's out there, period. And so it's really 9 billion is a joke, as Henry said. It is a complete joke, but it's not a joke relative from zero. But we should be thinking in terms of 100 billion, 500 billion, $1 trillion, where people are lined up outside of Tracy's office to try to get their money in because they're obligated. It's part of the effort to create, a broader society.
So I have the question for Tracy now. Based on what we just heard from Manny and that the money is out there and these people should be at your door, Tracy, what is your constraints? What is holding you back from being able to do what we just heard?
Well, it's the due diligence process, right? If you look at the due diligence process for a fund, baked in are barriers and systemic biases throughout. So I'll give you an example. You have to have a certain track record to get capital from pension funds or more institutional. Well, we know 98.7% of the asset managers around the world are white men. That means we're not allowed into the firms to get the track record. So how are you supposed to do that? You're left
Chicken
out.
before the egg.
Yeah, then it's has your team work together? Well, if each one of us can't get into a firm to get the track record, how are we going to work together? That means 2 or 3 of us have to be in the same firm, right? Or you've invested together. Well, once again, and if you go through the due diligence process for pension funds, for banks, and just the emerging manager programs, baked through the process are barriers. And I actually wrote an article about it, how it was called, how on the impact side, foundations, how foundations are failing Black and brown fund managers and how they can fix it. That was listing the solutions. And then now there's a new due diligence 2.0 commitment where we're asking asset allocators to take a pledge to look at due diligence differently. Look at the domain expertise of the team. Look at their operating background. There's so many different ways you can look at what is institutional ready. So that's one thing, that the system is just baked in to be biased, right? And then a lot of these same institutions won't come in early in the fundraising process. They'll wait till your last close. Well, by that time, you can find other people to come in your last close. If we're raising $100 million at 75 million, I don't need that capital. You need that capital first, because a lot of investors are like, we won't come in first. We want to follow someone else's due diligence. That is another barrier. And I can list 10 more that keep firms out. And like Manny was talking about, and Henry, the amount of capital we're talking about is literally a rounding error. Like, it would not matter to banks or to pension funds if 1%, 5% went into a fund to fund and was aggregated. So I think one, the due diligence process, and then when capital comes into these firms, and then aggregating this capital, because this capital is coming from us. Who are the teachers? Who are the public? Who are the government employees? That's us, right? But our money is not going back into our communities. So it has to be a whole mindset change and stop reverting to the mean. The way that people have been doing things in the same way in the past, it needs to be innovative. And that's around job creation. Henry is 100% right. The jobs of the future, IA and robotics is not going to kill jobs, it's changing jobs. And it's once again, we're going to be left out of those jobs of the futures and getting those skills. So, and if we come into these manufacturing firms where technology is running them, we're exposing a different demographics to technology, to entrepreneurship, and then they'll want to do it. You know, it's do what you see. And, you know, I could go on forever. I have so many things to say, but we really need to look at this system differently and not do things the exact same way, but it's brown and black.
Well, that brings me to a great question for Henry. Henry, since you were mentioned so much in Manny and in Tracy's comments, I'm going to ask you the question. What types of investments in infrastructure is required to reverse this trend in this current environment?
All kinds. So I'll just slice up to what we're talking about right now. I mean, we've been talking about the banks a lot, but, you know, direct lending has taken off. So people have, you know, kind of, I don't want to say moved away from banks, but they found capital access partners. I think the key, honestly, is just understanding wealth creation, because I hear a lot of times people are given the wrong information. We heard earlier about, you know, home ownership. Like these stats are available. You can go online, look at the Federal Reserve. The rich don't have their investments based in their home. The rich invest in stocks and equities. I mean, the top 1% added $5 trillion to their collective wealth in the first 3 quarters of 2020. And how did they do that? Corporate and mutual fund shares grew by $4 trillion in the first 3 quarters of 2020. So 4/5 of their gains were in stocks and equities. So if we're going to talk about wealth creation, we have to understand how people are making money, because money moves. And the key is when you understand where their distress is, because that's your opportunity to make money. You buy businesses at a low cost, and then when the price is raised, you sell it. I mean, this is basic. This is what all the private equity firms do. This is what, you know, all the IBers do. But we are still stuck in this mode of, you know, go to school, get your formal education, get your MBE, you know, own your own home, get a job in corporate America for 20 years, save $100,000 and you may be able to retire. That game is dead. We have moved into a new system where you have to be a student of wealth, and you have to be a student of where the money is moving, and you have to think global. We haven't mentioned global, but 96% of the world is outside the United States. And we act like we live in this like cocoon, like we can't do business outside the US. I mean, I worked with one of our Detroit MBA centers, and they were doing business with Canada. I mean, I had a San Antonio MBA export center that did business with Mexico. I went to Mexico City. We literally did $100 million worth of deals and opportunities in a 5-day business trip. Why? Because we had a Hispanic delegation that went to Mexico City, stuck them in a room for 7 days, and they can do business with themselves. We have to leverage our culture. I mean, we talk about minority. We're only a minority in the United States. If you look at the fastest growing markets, Africa, India, China, it's who we call minority United States, and we need to start leveraging that.
I couldn't agree more. Well said. And with that, I want to thank each and every one of you for your participation and your insight into this topic. I think this is a topic we need to continue to have. But I want to stop now to introduce you to one of our star colleagues here at the Milken Institute. Aron is the managing director of our Center for Financial Markets. And he has been on the front line of dealing with this very issue and very topic, and at the legislative level, at the policy level, at the regulation, and all ways in products. So anyway, without further ado, I want to introduce Aron Brujo.
Thank you, Jane, and thank you to our speakers and the moderator for a great discussion. We just heard a litany of facts that unpack the issues and presented a path forward. Central to this is a need to look beyond the explaining the status quo to more focusing on action and the outcomes we want. I just want to remind folks, last month we heard some startling figures with regards to COVID vaccine distribution. Even though Black Americans were 13% of the population, only 6% of the vaccine distribution has gone to them, all while the mortality rate of Black Americans was more than double that of white Americans. And according to McKinsey research, it's as much as 4 times more than white Americans in some states. I want to pause and let us think about that. More than double the mortality rate, but only half the access to the vaccine. America, we can do better. Not only because it's the right thing to do, it's actually the smart and economic thing to do. At the Center for Financial Markets, we're focused on how can we leverage financial markets, products, and services to ensure shared prosperity. We just heard that addressing the racial wealth gap can unlock $1 to $1.6 trillion of economic potential in this country. That means it's good not just for the local community, but it's great for the country at large. However, I'm not necessarily suggesting go out and just fund one Black business or one entrepreneur. We must stay focused on advancing the ecosystem, as Henry and others said, to ensure sustained activities. An ecosystem that allows stakeholders that understand the community, where the good opportunities are, and how to fund them. That's why it's important to leverage minority depository institutions to promote access to credit, all the things that Joe is mentioning. That's why it's important to leverage Black asset managers to promote access to equity capital, all the things that Tracy's mentioning. However, let me be clear, this is not a charity case. I can say empirically, on the banking side, when you look at the return of assets on MDIs and compare them to non-MDIs within an asset band, they're just as competitive. The issue is scale. On the access to equity side, returns of minority-owned private equity GPs have shown to outperform their peers, but less than 2% of the $69 trillion in assets under managed is managed by them. Some of you say, how can that be? The market is efficient. It would have to make sense that if it was efficient, it would have found these organizations and already put capital there. I reject that because for most people, they forget a market is efficient only when there's efficient flow of information. When was the last time you visited Detroit, Harlem, Baltimore, let alone diligenced a deal there? Asymmetrical information exists. That's why it makes sense to leverage diverse financial institutions to find the opportunities that are worth putting capital in. Nonetheless, they find it a hard time to get capital for themselves and to scale their opportunities. That's why the Center for Financial Markets is working on a primer for how stakeholders, large banks, corporates, state and local governments, on how to partner with MDIs and CFIs to better meet the needs of the community. That's why we at the Center for Financial Markets are leaning in to establish a dedicated program on diversity in asset management. And we're looking for partners to join us in this effort. The current crisis offers a unique opportunity. We heard there's trillions going to be flowing into key industries, everything from resilient infrastructure, repatriation of strategic supply chains. Today it was announced that the top 600 billionaires created $1.3 trillion of wealth during the pandemic. That's in the middle of an economic crisis, unheralded, their wealth increased by 1.3 trillion. With an administration that says its stated objective is to promote racial and economic justice, I think we need to figure out how to engage minority firms to be a participant in that rising tide. So across the Milken Institute, we're looking at ways of leveraging our evidence-based approach to bring research and convenings like you just saw today, to bring the public and private sector together to advance tangible solutions to achieve these objectives. Ensuring these critical groups are both increased in number, scaled in size, means multiple shots on goal to create wealth in pursuit of the American dream. Because we are all equal, we need to focus on promoting equal access and pursuing the American dream. If this sounds somewhat familiar, you're right. Perhaps not in the letter, but definitely by the spirit of it. It was declared as part of the Declaration of Independence, no less. You know what I'm talking about. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Equal chance in pursuit of the American dream. That's what today's session is all about. Again, thank you to our esteemed panelists for joining us in today's session. And thank you to all of you, our listeners. We encourage you to visit milkeninstitute.org to learn more about what the Institute is doing in this space on wealth inequality and other issues for you to get involved in. Resources will include various reports, access to previous sessions, and ongoing podcast series featuring our chairman, Mike Milken, on an array of global thought leaders on this and much, much more. And with that, thank you. And look forward to having you at our next forum.